Assalamu alaikum students. Today we will be learning about unit number 11, books and printing. Today's first topic is the written word, that how people began to write thousands of years ago and how it went through evolution, that is the change, that now we can see the modern writing. So as you can see, this is a timeline drawn on your book's page number 93. This timeline starts from 3500 BCE. Do you remember what's BCE? Yes, before Christ era. And this timeline reaches up to 1000 CE. Do you remember what's CE? Yes, Christ era. So, somewhere just after 3500 BCE, the writing started on clay from Mesopotamia, which is now Iraq. These people did the first writing we know about. So, from the clay, we now move on to 2000 BCE, the oldest writing from the Indus Valley carved on stone. And then, under the timeline, it reaches up to somewhere near 1250 BCE, where the ancient Egyptian writing on papyrus, a type of paper made from reeds. Basically, papyrus is a material similar to thick paper that was used in ancient times as a writing surface. It was made from the pith of the papyrus plant. So basically, a pith is the tissue or the spongy or soft part inside the papyrus. Then moving on to the timelines, after 500 BCE, we see the ancient Greek writing on a stone wall in Athens. Do you remember what's Athens? Yes, it's a city in Greece. Then we move on to the orange part of the timeline where the CE has started from the zero, and we see that somewhere near 250 CE we have the writing from China on paper. The Chinese invented paper in the 2nd century CE, and they were actually the very first people to invent the paper. Now moving along the CE timeline, we see after 750 CE a page written on paper in Baghdad, now in Iraq. So the writings began from the clay to the stones, then on papyrus, and then on the walls, and then finally on paper. Now next we will be studying about the evolution of books, that is how the books changed their form. At the beginning of the 15th century, the pages of expensive books were made from parchment. What is parchment? Parchment is a very thin calf, sheep or goat skin. In the first picture you can see the parchment pages, and in the second picture you can see the skin stretched to make the parchment. Hey, I know, it's very brutal, right? The covers of the book were made from leather, which is much thicker and tougher skin. Now the next you could see very fine quality parchment named vellum, which was used for special books. In the next picture you can see the quill pens from Goose. Scribes copied books with quill pens. What are scribes? A scribe is a person who copies out documents, especially one employed to do this before printing was invented. And how do they make quill pens? Well, they cut the ends of the feathers to make them sharp, then dip them in the ink. Now in this slide, you can see the carvings on stone from ancient Mesopotamia. They pressed the stone into clay to copy the pictures. I'm sure you all must have seen Play-Doh and played with it. So just like in Play-Doh, when you press the cutters and the shape appears on the Play-Doh, just like that, the Mesopotamia people, they pressed the stone into clay to copy the pictures. In the next picture, you could see a block cutter on a wood block. This is basically a European block cutter at work in the 15th century. And this picture is a print from a wood block. Interesting, right? Also, do you know paper making spread from China to the Islamic world in the 8th century? The first paper mill in Europe was in the Islamic part of Spain in the 11th century. Paper was made from linen and other cloth. It was used for cheaper books. Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back to unit number 11, Books and Printing. Today we will be completing the rest of the chapter of your unit number 11. So let's start with the e-lecture number 2 of Social Studies, grade 4. Now let's have a throwback at what we have learned in this chapter up till now. The people began to write thousands of years ago. The Chinese invented paper in the 2nd century CE. Europeans did not make paper until hundreds of years later. Books were copied by hand using a quill pen and ink. People in ancient times used blocks with pictures and letters carved on them to print on soft clay. Is early printing. Let's have a look at how the early printing started. As long ago as 3500 BCE, people in Mesopotamia carved pictures on hard materials such as stone. They used these for stamping copies of pictures. Later then, they began to carve writing on them. From about 220 BCE, people across Asia carved writing on blocks of wood to print whole pages. The writing was back to front, that is, in mirror form, so that it would print the right way around. By about the 9th century, the Chinese printed books this way. In Europe, they printed religious pictures on cloths with wood blocks. From about 1400, they printed many of these and other pictures on paper. They began to print books like this called block books. This was much quicker than copying books by hand, but the printer had to make a block for each page. In China, in the 11th century, a man named Bi Sheng made separate letters from clay and baked them in a fire. Those letters were then solidified. He put those letters in a metal frame and covered it with wax. Wax is the same material from which the candles are made. Then he pushed those letters onto the wax so that they stayed onto the metal frame, and then that frame was used for printing. He could arrange those letters in a different format to make a different page. That's how China invented the first printing machine. The next topic is a new type of printing. Between 1234 and 1241, an official in Korea named Cho Yun-oi made metal letters for printing. So before, China made letters while baking them in a fire. They made it from clay. But now, a Korean named Cho Yun-oi made metal letters for printing. But for a long time, printing was only allowed for books for the government. About 200 years later, a German named Gutenberg made metal letters to print with. He also made a printing press, a machine for print. So how Gutenberg came up with this press and how did it work and what mechanism was used and how it affected the overall European printing presses, let's have a look at a video shown in the next slide.
The movable metal typeset printing is one of the greatest inventions of the last millennium. It revolutionized the way people created and produced books. But what exactly is movable typeset, and why was it such a big deal? Before the movable type printing press was invented, books were expensive and either copied by hand or made using block printing. Copying books by hand was tedious and time-consuming, and scribes sometimes made copying errors. Block printing meant that text and images had to be carved into blocks of wood, then covered with ink and stamped onto a page. These blocks were time-consuming to create and use. By 1450, less than 30,000 books existed in all of Europe. All of this would change with the innovations of Johannes Gutenberg. In the late 1390s, Johannes Gutenberg was born into an upper-class family in Mainz, Germany. He learned various crafts like blacksmithing, jewel cutting, and goldsmithing. Around 1450, he began developing new techniques for improving the printing press. Gutenberg created a process using movable metal type, which meant that letters could be rearranged into countless patterns. This was faster and more accurate than any previous method. It made books and tracts much more affordable. Gutenberg's first major project was printing the Bible in Latin. By 1500, there were over 200 printing shops in Europe. It is estimated that between 8 and 20 million books were printed during those first 50 years. This type of printing press would lead to the mass production of the Bible. This meant that the Bible was more accessible and affordable to people than ever before.
After this invention, printing became cheaper and cheaper. About 150 years after Gutenberg set up his printing press, the first newspaper, The Relation, was printed in Germany in 1605. And here's a page from The Relation that you can see on this slide. Let us go through the key facts that we have learned from this chapter so far. Woodblock printing started in Asia. The first person to print separate letters lived in China. Cho Yunoi made the first metal letters for printing in the 13th century in Korea. Gutenberg invented a printing press that used metal letters in the 15th century. Printing helped to spread the learning and new ideas. Thank you for listening to our lecture. If you like this video, kindly hit the like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel. All the videos will be uploaded on our YouTube channel for the completion of syllabus. Also, hit the bell icon for getting updates regarding the YouTube videos. If you loved this video, please don't forget to share it with your family and friends. Thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.